Welcome.
Thank you very much. I feel a little bit of trepidation and a little bit intimidated to have a microphone and cameras and so forth. If I'd known that there would be this formal an occasion, I would have prepared. And I really had in mind it would be a much more informal session, and learn from you what you'd like to talk about and talk informally. But I do have some ideas that I was going to propose to you to talk about. So I'll do that, and I'll just try to fake it and make this up as I go along, with your permission and with your interruptions and questions or discussion or whatever, because I really would like to talk with you about these topics. And I'm not at all sure that the topics I had in mind are the topics you want to talk about. But I thought, well, we have nearly 3 hours, so I thought really 3 topics would maybe be permissible and break things up a little bit. I think they're related. The first one that I had in mind to talk about was prediction methods in criminal justice, which we started talking about already at breakfast. Helps to show the centrality of that topic. At least you can't escape it. You talk about it at breakfast immediately on arrival. Then, related to that, I would like to talk about sentencing and the aims of sentencing. And, of course, my scheme is that there will be issues about prediction that enter into that subject, that topic, and we'll find out, if you already do know, actually, that there are controversies about the use of prediction in sentencing decisions. And then, third, arising out of that controversy, I'd like to suggest a different way of conceptualizing the problem and illustrate that concept with some data that I have from a study in New Jersey. And then get your views as to about this concept and whether I should just drop it, forget it, Gottfredson, it won't work. Here's what's wrong with it, which I'd like to hear from you, because if you don't scare me away, I may just go ahead and pursue this topic. And I'd really like to have your criticism of the idea. So that's my scheme, which boils down to coming here for your consultant help. But it's a long road to get there, and the first topic is then about prediction. Since you haven't interrupted me yet, I'll just press on. Well, we might talk about why prediction is important in criminal justice. Prediction is one of the most important aims of science, for one thing. If you ask most people what's the purpose of science, they'll scratch their head and they'll say, well, understanding. And if you press a little further as to how you know if you understand a phenomenon, they'll say, well, you can predict it and you can control it. So prediction and control seems to be, to many people, a basic aim of science. And then if you think about the idea of control, then it seems obvious to most people that you can't control events unless you're first able to predict them. So that's a pretty powerful argument that the idea, at least, of prediction is central to science, however you want to define the aims of science. It's also the case that in criminal justice, we make decisions about offenders at every step in the process, and I believe it can be claimed that at each of those steps you find an element of prediction or predictive attitude. I'm going to go on at more length this afternoon about this, but if you just look at any of the decisions, including the sentencing decision, it's obvious that some predictive judgments are made somehow. If you look at parole decisions, same is the case. Probation officers make predictions. The judge setting bail makes a prediction. So the point is only that you find an element of prediction, subjective prediction or objective-based prediction, no matter, there's a prediction element in most decisions that are important in the criminal justice system. Well, we've had in our field, in criminology and criminal justice, we've had studies of prediction, as you very well know, for quite a long time now, since, what, 1908, you've probably got a reference, 1908 or so, 1918, somewhere in there, people were studying prediction, particularly of parole outcomes, and to some extent probation outcomes. Well, what are the usual results? The usual results are that you can code some elements of information from a case file, and you can predict some degree of validity, which customers will succeed on parole or probation, which will fail. Typically, you will find that some items such as defense has maybe some predictive utility, usually people convicted of person offenses, homicide, etc., usually do well on parole. People convicted of offenses like forgery, bad checks, car theft, usually do more poorly. Study after study, you find, these items. Age, typically find that older offenders do better than younger offenders. We know, the one thing we know about crime, generally, which we've known for 100 years or so, is that there's an age distribution that's kind of important. That, young people do crimes, and then as people get older, distribution tapers off and don't do so many crimes. So typically in those studies, you find that older offenders do better, younger offenders do less well in terms of some criteria of success or failure. Drugs, however you code it, tends usually to be a poor prognostic sign, if you use that language. Alcohol abuse, same thing. Prior record, however you count it, number of arrests, number of convictions, time between arrests, longest time free in the community. Any way you want to cut the rap sheet, code the prior record data, it turns out to be related to success or failure on probation, parole, or whatever. So you do find items of that sort that are useful in prediction, and you find them study after study, and so you can make a prediction device with some validity. So you can thereby defeat the argument that you can't predict. You can predict. It's known. You can do it. How well you can do it is a different question. And sort of a summary answer to that question is, well, modestly. You can't predict very well. You can predict with some degree of validity. You can't predict very well. So there's large errors, a big overlap between groups, etc. You can predict a little bit, with a little bit of validity. I thought I would, I don't know what your interests are, but I thought, is there a blackboard?
Yeah, I think.
Oh, it's behind you. Yeah.
You wouldn't need this right now,
No.
do you?
No.
Okay.
So thank you. Oh, okay. Thank you. I thought I would offer to you a recipe for a prediction study in case you are really dying to know how you go about a study such as I described, and we could talk about the methods that are involved in doing that. And it's really quite straightforward, but you'll see that the steps can get complicated. But the basic recipe is simple and it's straightforward. So I was going to call it a recipe. How do you spell recipe? E-P-I? Recipe. Is that right? Huh? Put an I here? E here? Oh, that looks better. Recipe for... How do you spell prediction? We have a recipe for prediction. First move, what would be the first move?
Deciding what we want to predict. What's
Hey.
the problem?
That's right. So that might not be simple, but what to predict would be the first question. So you need to define some criterion. To keep it real simple, let's say success or failure. Usually called the criterion. Define success for the purpose of the study. Maybe we should be careful and say for the specific limited purpose of the study. So we'll come back and see if this is complicated or not. We'll see. After we did that, what would we do? We'd have to collect some information thought relevant to this prediction task, right? Collect information about the offender. Let's say thought related to the criteria. That is a success failure. How do we get the ideas that the data would be related? Well, they could come from prior studies, such as I mentioned, what other people had found. They could come from some theory. In every case, you'd be formulating some hypothesis that this data element you're going to extract from the files or whatever is related to success or failure. And those data would have to be sufficiently. It would have to be available, for one thing. If you're coding things from case files, you'd usually find out that you have a lot of hot ideas about what might be useful in prediction, but they didn't collect that in the Department of Corrections. Or they collected it some of the time, but rarely, etc. So it'd have to be at least reasonably available. It would have to be sufficiently reliable. Have to be sufficiently accurate, have to be sufficiently valid for the purpose of the study. So now we got a criterion to predict. We got some data thought relevant. I guess the next step would be to in this recipe you'd have to measure each item, including the criterion. Brings up a lot of problems. Then you have to mix this mixture various ways. Use computer, various analyses. Let's say various statistical methods. Is that all you have to do? Choose a criterion, collect information related, including criterion, measure all these data elements, mix them together, predict the criterion by some method. Result would be, depends on the methods, Typically, it would be some equation. Maybe not. Maybe equation, or other procedure. For scoring each person, example familiar to you would be, you might have an equation that looks like this. Which you're already studying in other classes. Linear equation. It looks like a multiple regression equation. I have to add an E over here. Errors involved. So now you have some equation. So you can give a score to each person that's supposed to be predictive of the person's outcome on probation. Last step, most important step, I believe. Proof of the pudding. How well the method works in another sample, at least one other sample. That is a sample other than the sample you used to derive this equation or method or whatever. Interesting feature of this recipe is that I'm claiming that's the most important step, and it's a step that you'll find in the literature is very often left out. That is, you'll find in the literature many studies called prediction studies, and there's no test of the validity of the instrument. People do the arithmetic, do the equation and so forth, and say, here's the device, go help yourself and go use it. Actually, I left out an important step, so maybe I have to give it a different number. You know what step I left out is you have to select a sample from the population that you want to study. So I should have put that first. Select a sample representative of the population, let's say, of interest. So the trick would be, if you wanted to do this work for probation in Texas, you'd have to find some way. You're probably not going to be able to study all probationers in Texas. There must be a pretty good number of them. You'd want to figure out some way to get a sample that you could reasonably believe is representative of the whole for some time period. Various ways to do that. You know, the usually advocated way is called what? I know I'm telling you stuff you already know. If you wanted to get a representative sample, how would you do that? You'd probably try to get a random sample. And the definition of random is what? I just can go down to the pull cases out of the file? You're not liking that. That sounds more like haphazard sample. What do you mean by random sample?
Each has an equal chance of being selected.
That's the definition, isn't it? Everybody in the population has an equal chance of being selected for the sample. We choose a random sample because what we're really interested in is a representative sample, right? We really want the sample to represent that. Okay. Obviously, there are pitfalls at every step in this simple recipe. One is this one, the sampling one. If you really think that that's an important step in this recipe, then you would have a lot of pause before you took, let's say, a probation study done in Wisconsin or someplace and used it in Texas without looking to see whether it's valid for our Texans. It might be, but it might not be. There's really no a priori reason to believe that you'd get the same result if you studied Texans than if you studied people in Wisconsin or California or someplace. So either you ought to do the work in Texas, or at least you ought to take that scale and just say, well, at least the proof of the pudding would be, if I don't want to redo the whole study, at least I'll go look and see if, for people in Texas, it still works, just as it did in Florida or wherever. So, that's a pretty important one, and how you do that is a topic of some interest. But this is also pretty central. How do you know if a person succeeds on probation or fails on probation? Are you going to limit your study to that? That there's either a probation violation or there's not. Well, it's important, but look how much it leaves out. I mean, it's obvious to us how much it leaves out. The probation violation might have been for a new crime. There might or might not have been a conviction for that crime. Probation violation might have been revocation in lieu of prosecution for that offense. It might have been that this was a rules violation, a technical violation, a rather different thing. Might have been for absconding, etc. It's sort of, if that definition, say it's probation or parole, and you're limited to that definition, it calls to mind the problem that that criterion that we just invented so readily here has at least two components, one of which might be the behavior of the offender, or the probationer or parolee, and another component is the behavior of the representatives of the system. So that if we're talking, for example, about parole, and the governor comes around and shakes his finger at all the parole board, and they're responsible for parole in this state, let's say, and says, you got to crank up on this, you might have more technical revocations. Well, you've got then, if that's the case, you've got systems kind of happening, impinging upon the reliability of your classification here. We said that down here, we said that the information we're going to collect from case files or whatever has to be sufficiently reliable, because we usually worry about the independent variable that way and its reliability, and we don't want to have a rubber ruler that you get a different answer every time you put that scale down. But even if you have a steel ruler that doesn't stretch very much and so forth, and yet you're measuring a table, the table keeps going in and out, expanding and contracting, you still have unreliability in your measure of the relation, because you have unreliability in your criterion variable. So it's equally important, or maybe more important, I don't know, to have reliability in your criterion variable as the independent variable you can use to predict. You might, for example, here you might be concerned about, well, how serious is the offense if there's a new offense? Different ways maybe to approach measurement of that or scaling of that. You might want to know, well, what about survival? Maybe some people stay longer on probation, survive in the community without doing harm. That might be of value. There are other ways. The only point is that that could be rather complex, and it might be deserving of your attention if you're interested in this kind of thing. Two issues arise here on collecting information, because probably you would come to this study with some ideas about what information would be predictive. Or you may have some particular criminological theory that you think, well, let's apply this theory. A lot of the prediction studies have been criticized, and justly so, as being kind of atheoretical, no theory. So now you go to the Department of Corrections, you want to code these data to test your theory. But again, they didn't collect those data. So what do? There's sort of two choices. You can go retrospectively and use those case files, code the data that are there and are available, use those data. Then you don't have to wait so long to do your study. You took a few years ago, people have been out on parole, let's say. You can follow them up readily and finish your study and get your dissertation done on time. all of that. But you don't get to choose the items of information that you want to collect. So if you want to do that, then you have to design your study somewhat differently and go prospectively. Advantage is you can define the items you want to collect, and you can go collect those data. Disadvantage is it takes you a long time, because now you have to wait for the people to go out on parole, succeed or fail, or do whatever they're going to do. So there's a kind of a choice point that's fairly important. Measuring each item gets you into all the scaling issues you probably talk about in your school. You know, what kind of scale and how do you scale those data, and what are the consequences of the scaling issues for the kinds of statistics you could use, and so forth. Would all enter here. I just said mix them up and use various statistical methods. Actually, there are a few that are customarily used, not all of which result in an equation. Usually, one would use, well, the earliest ones are not so bad. Professor Burgess, I think that's about 1918, something like that, just chose all the items with some predictive relation and gave a 1 for possession of the attribute and a 0 for lack of possession of the attribute. Add all those scores up, get a score, see if that score is related to the criterion. So you're giving like unit weight to every variable. Same as you'd do in making a psychological test, achievement test, whatever. You always get 1 point for each item and so forth. So that's what could be done, and sometimes in criminology it's called Burgess method, as a matter of fact. Just unit weight to each one. So you could say, for examples, you could say Burgess, the unit weight. You could use regression. The argument against the Burgess thing would be that see, you could put you could add to this one and also measure the relation of each item with every other item. Including the criterion. So now if you did that, you'd say, well, hey, Gottfredson, you coded the number of arrests, number of convictions. You know they're related. You can't get convicted without an arrest. So if you just tally it up right, you know there's some correlation between number of arrests and number of convictions. You know that older people have a chance of being arrested, more. So maybe that's an item there. So problem is you have all these interrelations among your predictor candidates. And the argument about Burgess would be, the principal argument would be, well, you didn't take account of the overlap among the items. There's no taking account of intercorrelations among the independent variables. So what are you going to do about that? So then what you say is, well, what we'll do is we'll use the correlation matrix. And from the correlation matrix, we'll get a multiple regression equation. That takes account of the overlap, and moreover, it weights the variables differently, weights them optimally, according to one criterion, which is, that the sum of the squares of deviations from a straight line, some of the errors, the squared errors, will be minimized. So we've got a rule to select items and also to weight them. So we can weight the items and get these coefficients that, according to that logic, that rule about square deviations of the errors, it would be optimal. So you can say, I took account of that, and it's a good scheme. Or you could say, well, I could use discriminant function. Which has a little bit different logic. You've got two groups. One group succeeded, one group failed. And you could say, well, instead of the squared deviations of the errors around the regression line, what I want to do is separate those two groups as much as I can. You got some distribution of scores for the failures, over here, and you got some group for the successes. They each have, pull those distributions apart as well as I can. So I'll make the rule that I will find a linear equation such that the means of these two distributions will be as far apart as possible in relation to the variances, the pooled standard deviations specifically, of the two distributions. So the objective is now pull those distributions apart, get a linear equation. And it looks just like this one, except it doesn't have that, and then usually custom has a different symbol here. But it's just, it's a linear equation. And it does turn out that if you have just success and failure as a criterion, those two things are equivalent. It turns out that one is a transformation from the other, you could say it that way, or that these coefficients will be proportional to one another. If they're not, an error must have occurred, in the computer program or entering data or something. So those are really equivalent. Other people have said, well, a better way to mix the items would be to use some classification procedures. Find a way to group people in such a way that we'll have them in groups with different likelihoods of probation or parole, success or failure. A couple of schemes have been used widely in criminology to do that. One is called predictive attribute analysis. What you do there is get you have all these items that are, to make it simple, assume that all your independent variables, your predictor candidates, are dichotomous, as well as your criterion, success or failure dichotomous. So you have a 0 or 1, presence or absence, prior record or not, prior conviction or not, over 30, under 30. All the items are like that. Then you could make matrix that would look like so, only bigger. So this is your criterion, and this would be an item, B, C, and this is your criterion. I didn't draw this big enough, but let me see, something like that. So then, what you could do is just look at the association of each item. See, this might be prior record. This might be older, whatever. You could look at the association of each item with each other item, but you could also look at the association of each item with the criterion over here. So what you'd probably do is use the statistic called chi-square, right? Measure of independence of the two attributes. So you could get a chi-square value that would go in here for each item. And then, according to this method, predictive attribute analysis, what you do is you find the attribute with the largest value of chi-square. N's the same, constant n. So that means that there's the closest association between this item and success failure. Out of all of your predictors, that's the best single predictor, right? So what you do then, this is all the customers here. That was older. So then you put all the over 30s over here, and you put all those 30 or low or younger over here, right? Then you go back and you make the same matrix again. So then you look for the over 30 folks. What's the single best predictor? Then you divide them on that guy. Do the same for the younger folks. Find the single best predictor. Whoop. Likely not the same item. And then guess what you do then? Then you go around again. And you just keep doing that as long as you want, or until you have some stopping rule, as many groups as you want, or you run out of significant chi-squares. You'd probably have to invent a stopping rule. If you had a large sample, you would. So it's one way. What you're doing is saying, well, for any group, for the first group, I'll find the single best predictor. I'll divide the group on that attribute. Then within those groups, I'll look for the single best predictor. Divide on that attribute. Keep going. So then I'll end up with a tree diagram with n number of groups. And the conjecture is that those groups will differ. Well, they're going to have to. They were selected, really, on the basis of the association of the criterion. So it works. It will give you an n number of groups that will differ in terms of a criterion such as this. Some of it turns out to be kind of arbitrary, and one criticism would be that it tends to be kind of unreliable in the sense that you can't replicate the process very well, because often these chi-square values will be real close. I mean, what's the difference between 9.84 and 9.96 with the data that we have to work with? Arbitrarily, you chose one over the other. Next time around, it may come up the other one. This method won't replicate very well. But replication is not the same as validity, right? We're talking now about replication of the method. Proof of the pudding still might give you some evidence that, well, it works. It separates people into groups that differ. A different way that looks very similar is called association analysis. And what you do there is start out the same way and get these chi-square values. So now you have this is nothing, but you have a chi-square in each one of these. Then you make this whole table symmetrical. So this chi-square is the same as that chi-square, right? You're just copying from here down to here. It's a symmetrical table. And then you sum up all the columns to get the sum of chi-square. So you have sum of chi-square here, here, and here. And then you also sum the rows. Why would I do that, by the way? Just a check, because the sum over here has to be the same as the sum down here unless I made a mistake. So the only reason you do that would be a check. So then what you do is you choose the attribute that has the largest sum of chi-square values. The reason you do that is that there's an argument that can be made that that's the item that will separate these folks into two groups that are, in terms of these data, most alike, and yet the two groups are as different as you can make them. Did I say that correctly? You're trying to get relatively homogeneous subgroups that are similar, and at the same time you like the groups to be different. And this rule, the logic of adopting a rule is that that will do that. So you take the largest sum of chi-square and you divide up this way. And then for each subgroup you do it again. You've got to get the matrix again, get the sum, select the variable, divide them out. Notice that you didn't even use the data on the association of the attribute with the criterion. You ignored that. So it's more of a general classification method, an empirical classification method. Doesn't necessarily have to do with your criterion. But since you selected the items because you thought they were related to the criterion, it might be. And it turns out that when you do that, you get some validity, in prediction, when you use the proof of the pudding, rule. That will work. It also might have more general utility. It's also a little bit more stable. But in studies that have compared these different methods, these two have been the best. Usually, I think it could be argued, usually the regression one would come out a little superior, but the Burgess one would maybe be close at hand or just about as good, which, we went to all this trouble to do all the fancy statistics, and then we find out that the Burgess one is just as good. I should mention to you, since we're talking about the different methods here, that there's also a criticism of using regression in this case, because the data with a success and failure classification don't fit the model. The dependent variable is just a 0 or a 1. I already argued that was the same as discriminant function. The model doesn't fit, and if you just stop to think of it for just a minute, you would see why that is. If you have usual regression model, you got some correlation like this, and some scores down here, and some criterion over here, dependent variable over here. But we don't have that. We have success and failure, and we have then for scores going from 1 to whatever, we have scores down here, and we got scores up here, and we're finding by the rule that what the computer is doing for us is giving us a straight line like this. So then we get the results and say, gee, the computer is pretty good, but it's telling me that some of these folks have a probability greater than 1 of succeeding. Pretty good position to be in, but it doesn't make any sense. Some of these folks have probability less than 0. So it doesn't fit. And the reason is that we don't have, the scattergram here. We don't have a continuous variable on this dimension. It's not going this way. So it might be that if you could fit a curve more like this, it might make more sense. And it turns out that various logistic models fit the problem better. So a program, for example, Logit, or I think there are other ones, would be probably the choice from a statistician's point of view. But again, where I've seen that people did that, and also done the regression, and then looked at the whole situation in terms of the proof of the pudding, didn't make any difference. So that would be more sophisticated, but I don't think it would make any difference, which is kind of curious. It ought to make a difference. It ought to fit better. You should follow the rules that the statisticians come up with. The only rationale that I can imagine is that our data in this field tend to be so poor. There's so much sloppiness and slippiness in the data that we generally have to work with that that kind of sophistication doesn't seem to matter a whole lot. And that's probably why I think the Burgess method of just giving a point for every favorable attribute tends to work just about as well as a regression or the Logit or doing the classification studies or whatever. Just seems to work just as well. And I personally believe that it's a matter of data quality, and that what we therefore need to do, which nobody seems to argue against, but it's very difficult to achieve, is we need to improve the data quality throughout the criminal justice system to help. There are other reasons, why the Burgess might work. Well, for example, if you broke this equation down a little bit and started adding error, that the true value over here has got some error associated with it. We don't measure things perfectly. That's going to have some error. But this coefficient is going to have some error. In fact, we'll get that in our printout. It'll say standard error of the beta coefficient. So it has some error. This x data element has some error, right? And we could even break it down to different kinds of error, but we're multiplying the beta times the x. We're also multiplying the beta plus the error times the x plus the error. So we're squaring the error. So error is terrible, doing terrible damage here, whereas it may not do so much damage with a simple additive method. There are other arguments that maybe you could improve prediction by first using some classification method like this, to try to get relatively homogeneous subgroups, that is to try to get offenders who are in some sense more alike, and then develop your prediction method on those subgroups separately, a sort of a bootstrap operation, a statistical bootstrapping operation. The theory would be, and it turns out that it's easy to support, that if you take some whole group of inmates like you have in the Texas Department of Corrections, you get items like this and you look at the correlation matrix and then say do just the first step on the association analysis. In our example we made up, you had the older and the younger. Then you look at the correlation matrices for these two groups, and they're not going to look very much alike. They're going to look different. And once you discover that, you can't go back again. You can't go back and just go do the regression, because you know the regression is based on the correlations for the whole sample, and they're not giving you good estimates of the correlation coefficients for the older and the younger, in our example. So you can't go back. You have to do separate equations now. And there is good evidence that that may help improve validity of the measure. Well, I went on at such length that maybe I ought to pause and see what you'd like to do. I had some examples to show you, but I think we better skip it because I still wanted to raise with you those questions about sentencing, and I still wanted to give you my great idea. Does this make any sense to you?
The data collection, and we all talk about data quality, but it would seem that with the system with which we're dealing, that we would talk about massive system overhaul to clean up data. I mean, just in this right here, when we start talking about the offense, for instance, what in the world is an offense? Is it murder 1 or murder 2? Why is it murder 1 or murder 2? We're talking about the system now and not the act.
I think you're right, and if you really, if you were interested in that offense for your predictive purpose, very likely you'd prefer to have some measure of the behavior involved rather than a legal classification, since you know about plea bargaining and you know it's not going to always very accurately portray the behavior. But you could invent some behavioral descriptions and classify people in terms of those. It is a massive problem, and obviously it's a very difficult one because, in this room we're not the first to decry the situation, and people have been decrying it for, as long as I can remember, and that's a long time. But, we could have a standardized form that people would fill out, the pre-sentence investigation. I don't know if you have such a thing in Texas, but typically in probation departments there isn't. It's a social history narrative format, which tends to include what the person thinks is important to include. When I worked in corrections, I used to work a little bit about classification. We'd be reviewing the guidance center summaries and so forth. And I could always tell, before I got to the bottom, which sociologist had written the social history. I knew those guys. I could tell which psychologist wrote the psychology summary. So it was obviously you had to be telling me something about the sociologist, psychologist, as well as the inmate. Some nodding your head, you find the same thing as do. We ought to be able to agree at least on some core elements of a data system that we would collect early in the system and carry through. And there are efficiencies involved because you know very well how many questions are asked over and over and over again and recorded over and over and over again from arrest to discharge from custody. Same questions. It was not integrated. So it is a massive, big problem. But, the issues are serious enough that we ought to take it seriously, and we ought to have a systematic data collection mechanism for criminal justice. It ought to be doable. There's no state that has such a thing, I'm pretty sure. But you could at least try to define, like the offense problem, you could at least try to define behavioral, codes or something. We didn't talk very much about why you would want to predict anyway. I mean, I claimed it was fundamental science and so forth. I think it could be argued that there are three reasons you might want to be interested in this line of effort. And the first one of which is not for the selection of people for parole or for probation or whatever, but for a research purpose. The problem is that over and over again in corrections we have development of new programs, and we have a great hue and cry from the likes of us in academia and some other places to evaluate those programs, to examine whether they work in terms of the goals of the program and so forth. But it's very rare that we get the opportunity to have a classical experimental design with random assignment for some pool of subjects to experimental and control. Usually we don't have that, so we have the problem of selection for the treatment that's interfering with our conclusions, even if we follow them up and want to compare them with people that went through the system but not through that treatment. So we've got a bias in the two groups, which is a selection bias. If you have, on the other hand, you have some prediction for each offender in that whole pool before the treatment is applied, based on information before treatment, right? Then it ought to be up to the people doing the treatment, if it works, to make your prediction invalid for the treated group. That is, if you can predict the outcome of treatment before treatment, and also regardless of treatment, it's very hard to argue that the treatment worked. If you're able to support the null hypothesis after you correct for the bias using your prediction instrument, and you still support the null hypothesis, it's pretty hard to argue that the treatment had a big effect. It doesn't prove that it didn't, right? But it's pretty persuasive information. And if you were a program planner or the Department of Corrections commissioner or whatever, you'd probably say, okay, I'm convinced the differences we observed were due to selection factors. We typically selected the better risks for the treatment. And all through corrections, it's my opinion that when we use treatments, if we've got any, we use them for the people that need it the least. We use those treatments typically for the better risk offenders, whether we're sending them to psychotherapy or counseling, or putting them on probation or whatever. We tend to do that. So having the prediction device beforehand might help you in some quasi-experimental design, some statistical design, if you don't have the experiment. If you do have the experiment, it still might help you, because what will happen is something will go awry in the experiment. And random assignment didn't work. The judges promised they'd do it, but then they didn't do it. Can you imagine a judge not telling the truth? I can't imagine it, but they promised, and they still didn't do it. They didn't follow the design, so you ended up with a bias anyway, even though you had an experiment. So you need some way to try to control statistically for that. So, there are various methods now you can use, because you could use, if you have set it up like an experimental design, you've got some treatment group and a control group or a comparison group. You want to analyze the variance, but you have a covariate, which would be your prediction measure. So you could use analysis of covariance, or you could just get a prediction score for everybody in each of your groups, and you could test whether or not there's a difference between the observed result and the expected result, expected from your prediction. Or you could put your prediction in early in a regression and see whether the differences are wiped out. Is there still a significant coefficient for the treatment? So I believe those methods all amount to very much the same thing. A variety of ways you could do it. The important thing would be having some handle on the selection bias before the treatment. So that's a powerful use, I think, of this sort of a method, and it's probably the most useful, the attribute of a prediction method that is probably most useful to us in the long run. It's not usually advocated to be so. Usually it's advocated that, well, those instruments will help us select people, for a given placement, probation or parole or whatever. I think they might be of some utility in that way. But I don't think it would be the principal use. but that's a possible use, along with other information. A third use would be for more general policy or general program planning, which we've seen a lot lately in probation, with some differential caseload assignment depending on some risk assessment at the outset. So the argument there is you might use a tool of this sort for greater efficiency and use your officers where they be most needed, not watch so closely those good risks who don't need to be watched. Sometimes it's hard to get people to quit doing that. If you have a parole officer who's known this guy who did this 15 years for homicide, but the parole officer's already known him for 8 years. He likes to visit him. It's kind of entertaining. They're old friends and so forth. He doesn't want to give that up and go downtown and, argue with this young orangutan. So, people want to stick with that. But there might be a value to that kind of program planning use. I think there is. Do you think there is? Do you think it's time for a break?
Time for, you want to take a 15-minute break? Okay.
You want a half-hour break? He's about 15 minutes?
15-minute break. Okay. Can I meet the students in the class? Those who are taking the course. Yeah.
One was prediction, and that has to do with the word risk that was on the agenda. What the agenda said was stakes and risk. I don't have it. But said, in sentencing. Stakes and risk in sentencing. So we only talked about risk. And I would like to talk about sentencing. With you more than to you, actually. I've been talking to you, but I came to talk with you. So talk at me a little bit. What I need to do is relate the topics of risk and sentencing. Why sentencing? I think it's particularly interesting because sentencing seems to me to be kind of a hub of the whole criminal justice system. Kind of captures everything about the criminal justice system in terms of the goals of the system, what it's here for, why do we have corrections, why do we have police, etc. It's all sort of centered on the sentencing decisions. Once an offender is convicted, he has to be sentenced. You could claim that since sentencing means that a convicted offender is publicly, authoritatively, definitively, decisively, enduringly told that he or she did harm to an innocent victim. That ought to be enough, for most of us. Most of us in this room would find that to be punishment. But we rarely stop there. We rarely stop and say that's enough punishment to have that public disgrace. We usually figure out that something else has to be done with the offender. And in the last decade or so particularly, I believe it can be claimed there have been marked changes in that sentencing decision-making. Particularly, I think 3 in number. The same could be said for parole, by the way. You could make this same argument, I think, about parole decisions. We'll focus on sentencing. But the first concerns that began to be vehemently expressed had to do with issues of fairness and issues of procedure. Decisions weren't being made with due care. They didn't have sufficient due process. Didn't have sufficient, regularity. decisions were arbitrary and capricious, words that judges do not like to hear, arbitrary and capricious. Objections to the whole procedure and to fairness issues. Also, an objection was that it's too uncertain what the penalty will be or what the sentence will be or whether parole will be given. So that, there's a great deal of uncertainty. When it came to parole boards, the argument was, one, it's not fair. Sentence a person to prison, not tell him or her how long she's going to have to serve. That's not fair. Second, it was argued, I don't know of any data on the topic, but it was argued that it's not even helpful for rehabilitative ends, that uncertainty was an unfavorable kind of thing. So there was an argument about uncertainty and so forth. And the third general complaint, of course, was that it doesn't work. The system isn't effective. Now, you heard all of these arguments about parole, you heard them all about sentencing, you heard them about corrections more generally. The result of that in the last decade is I think that there have been these three changes. One, there's been a move across the country toward greater determinacy in sentencing. So there's been a demise of the relatively wide indeterminacy you've had in many states. California was a good example. They never had a really indeterminate sentence in California. Actually, they called it a quasi-indeterminate sentence. But it was pretty indeterminate. Robbery first, 5 years to life. Sentenced to the Department of Corrections for the term prescribed by law. Term prescribed by law was 5 years to life. Decision as to release would be made by a parole board. Checks, 6 months to 14 years. Pretty wide range. I think in Texas you always had relatively more fixed sentences and fixed by the jury than relievance. Is that correct?
Sentences?
Uh-huh.
No, it's very indeterminate.
Very indeterminate.
Indeterminate.
Selected by the
We
jury.
sentence both judge and jury. By
Both, either judge or, yeah, right. So it's fairly indeterminate. The state of Washington had almost completely indeterminate system until a few years ago. So that everybody, regardless of the offense, was sent, really for an indeterminate term, to be determined by the parole board. They had a few terms that were called mandatory prison terms, but that could be overcome by the parole board. So it wasn't really even mandatory then. And they've changed. They have a much more determinate system. So there's been a move in many states toward more determinacy by the legislature in fixing terms and narrower bounds that judges would have. So that has tended to narrow discretion somewhat. That's the second kind of general trend, is a narrowing of discretion. In most states, less discretion for the decision maker that's involved. And the third trend, it seems to me, has been that there's been a switch generally in our country about the fundamental aims of sentencing. So that until a decade or a little more ago, it was widely agreed around the country, that the principal aim of corrections, for example, is rehabilitation. California law at this moment says no. Aim of the sentence to prison is punishment. It used to say rehabilitation. Now it says punishment. So there's been a trend from the rehabilitative ideal and from aims such as incapacitation and aims such as deterrence toward the aim of desert, that is, deserved punishment. An interesting point is, I think, that these two general philosophies of sentencing are utterly opposed. The desert view is simply that if a harm is done, then there ought to be a punishment, and the punishment ought to be commensurate with the harm done and the culpability of the offender. There should be some proportionality between the punishment, which is deserved for that harm done, and the nature of the harm, the amount of harm. So if people do wrong, they are to be punished. Just as people who do right, we're supposed to be rewarded. It's part of the same philosophy, you do harm, you're supposed to be punished. How much are you supposed to be punished? Well, you're supposed to be punished at least proportionally to the amount of harm done, taking account of some culpability issues. There might be mitigating, aggravating factors involved. That notion, of course, looks back to the harm that was done, and only back to the harm done. It's not future-looking at all. Looks backward to the harm done, punishment required. The other three aims that I briefly mentioned, treatment, incapacitation, deterrence, all look forward to some future state of affairs. Forward-looking. They're not looking back so much to the offense, if at all. They're looking to the good that can be accomplished by whatever we do now. They're all predictive in nature. The desert one is not. It's a prediction that's made if you say, got to lock this person up in order to warn others not to do it. Deterrence. Got to lock this person up to teach her a lesson. That's specific deterrence. Looks forward. Prediction is involved. Punish her, she won't do it again. Got to lock her up because she needs counseling. She's got to get off drugs. Gets off drugs, she won't need to steal. Be all right. Treatment orientation. Future oriented. Right? Incapacitation. Got to lock her up so she won't do harm. At least she won't do harm while she's confined. All three of those then are forward-looking, utterly opposed to the desert orientation. So the basic point is simply that those two notions, I believe, are utterly in conflict. You can't accept one and the other. We do it all the time. In the courts, in corrections, parole, wherever you look, we're serving, both the desert punishment master and the utilitarian masters of deterrence, incapacitation, and treatment. But it's worthwhile to notice that these things are in conflict. Fundamentally, if you look at the basic rationale that's involved. So, how is this related to risk? Well, the easiest way to look at it would be in terms of the notion of incapacitation. Because there's so clearly a prediction involved. Lock the person up so that he or she won't be doing harm. A few years ago from Rand Corporation, you may know the study, Peter Greenwood had a model from a study he'd done, which the title of the report was Selective Incapacitation. The basic idea is very appealing. We've got all this prison crowding, which you know about in Texas, and you know about growth of prisons in Texas. We know about it in California. We certainly know about it in New Jersey. Although you got almost as many people backed up in the county jails waiting to get into prison as we have in prison. But we got plenty backed up. We've got 1,800 backed up for us. That's a very large number in county jails. But I heard that you have something like 12,000 right this moment. So we got all this crowding and everything. So Peter Goodwin had a very appealing concept. He said, here's what you do. You make a prediction study, and you predict which ones of these offenders, presently confined, will do crimes at a high rate. He studied robbers and burglars, people with those offense classifications. So I'm speaking pretty loosely when I say that. You know the reasons for that. I don't even like to say that, robbers and burglars. But he studied people convicted of robbery and burglary, and then he followed them up. No, he didn't follow them up. Excuse me. What he did was a questionnaire study. He did a questionnaire of confined inmates in prisons and jails in 3 different states. And in the questionnaire, which was carefully done, he asked them to report the crimes they had done in the past in a certain time period. So then he could look at the questionnaire about the offender, self-report, and the questionnaire about crimes done, and he could sort out which ones said they did crimes at a great rate. And so he made a scale that he called a prediction scale to sort them into groups. one group of which would be the high-rate offenders. And the argument was that what you ought to do is keep those people longer, give them longer terms in prison, incapacitate them, because the evidence says they're going to do so much harm if they're released. Release those low-rate offenders who aren't going to do so much harm. Save building prisons, help defeat the overcrowding problem, etc. Very appealing notion. Keep the right ones, in other words. Keep the high-rate offenders, let the others go. Net gain in terms of crime control and in terms of money. Problems with that, just as a prediction study. Let me mention that parenthetically because we're on the topic of sentencing. Parenthetically, though, see, he didn't have a validation sample. So when I wrote proof of the pudding, Peter didn't pay attention to that. He had an elaborate questionnaire study, is what he had. All the responses were at the same time from the inmates. He still could do a prediction study, but he hadn't done that, so he hadn't validated that instrument. Another problem was, of course, our sentencing discussion is that he had only confined offenders. By the way, he didn't pay attention to point number one that I'd forgotten. He forgot to A, because he didn't have a sample representative of any known population or any population he wanted to predict to. He had these kind of haphazard samples from 3 different systems. But mainly he didn't have the validation part. Also used self-report, and it's very hard to translate that operationally into what he had advocated, because you'd have to use official records and so forth. But that maybe could be remedied. But for a discussion about these issues in sentencing, that's not even the more important thing. That's only important for our earlier discussion. Important for our discussion just now is that from the desert orientation, it is simply unfair to punish a person for some future crime, a crime that's not yet done, which may or may not be done, which the person may not have even thought of doing, right? You're punishing that person now for some expected future harm. So that's unfair on the face of it. Even if that weren't the case, I claimed only that we can predict modestly. That means we're going to make errors. When you make errors in that prediction, as in all kinds of statistics, the errors are of 2 kinds. You have false positives and you have false negatives, right? False positives are the ones you kept in prison by your selection device. You kept them longer due to your error. And with Peter Gridwin's own data, using his data, even if you accepted that, you'd get about 2 false positives for every true positive. So for every one you correctly keep, you're going to keep 2 by mistake. Begins to sound pretty unfair. You also have the other kind of error, which is false negative error. That is, you might be releasing people predicted not to do harm, then they go do harm. So we got the problem that the offender in prison, it could be argued, has a right not to be treated as a false positive, and you got our citizens' right not to be set upon by a false negative. So there's a dilemma also about those errors. The only way to improve that, decrease the errors, is by using something like the recipe we were talking about and improve the validity of prediction. I'm claiming that's the only way you can reduce the number of errors. You can change the numbers involved by a cutting score, right? You can be very, very selective, and you make fewer false positive mistakes. But then you've only kept a small number, you haven't saved all the prison space. You say, got to save more prison space, move back down. Now you're going to have more and more false negative errors, as well as false positive errors, as well as capturing the hits. The more hits you want, the more misses you're going to get. That's the size of it. Okay? But the basic dilemma is this matter of fairness from a desert orientation. Simply not fair to punish a person for harm, he or she hasn't done yet. So you can argue that, we ought to stick with desert orientation and do punishment.
Are you saying that if you can successfully predict that that person will commit another offense, then it's okay to punish them for future?
Not me.
Even if you can?
Not
So
me.
what's the point of a prediction scale if you're not going to use that to punish them for future?
Yeah, exactly the dilemma. We've got, let's see, you're saying even if I can predict quite well.
If you can predict that I'm going to commit a crime in the future, and you don't use that to punish, to keep me incapacitated so that I don't, then what's the point of using a prediction scale?
Some people will say no point. Ought not use it.
Just period.
Right. Right. Some people certainly will argue you definitely ought not use a prediction scale, no matter about the accuracy of prediction. That's right. Symposium recently about the topic of prediction and violence. Professor Richard Singer, who's from a great university, Rutgers University, he's at the Camden Law School, argued this way. They were talking first about prediction, and they talked about how poorly people can predict. So then somebody got up and said, well, you know what? The emperor has no clothes. He got up and said, if the emperor had clothes, he should not be invited to this party. He's not supposed to be invited to this party if he has clothes or not. The reason is that the purpose of the criminal law is to administer punishment for the harm done in the past. Period. Right. So he said exactly what he said, no. Other people argue quite differently. Other people say, don't bother me about the harm done in the past. That's over and done. Plato said that. Plato said, we don't look back to the harm done. We look forward to the future and to the good that can follow from our actions in relation to the culprit.
Well, my interpretation of selective incapacitation is one of its, in fact, if not its whole purpose, is to reduce the prison population. And by doing that, they're only imprisoning the people that commit the most crime, theoretically.
Right.
We can predict this. That's what they're doing.
Right.
Well, I don't see any difference in doing that. I mean, if they are being punished for a crime they commit, we're not walking out and grabbing them off the street and saying, our scale says you're probably going to commit a crime. We are just releasing those who are not theoretically a danger to the community again. We're sort of moving into the community-based realm, or we're keeping them out of the institution. What is the major ideological problem that's not current, that we don't have with pretrial detention? It's the same thing. We're punishing someone. We're actually, in fact, it's worse because we're punishing someone, they've never even been convicted of a crime. The people that we are selectively incapacitating at least have been convicted of one crime. They do deserve to spend some time in prison. We're just releasing those maybe to a less secure facility or some sort of other program that we don't feel are going to be a major community risk.
I think that what you just said is really very important. But you were talking more, I heard, you're talking more about releasing good risks than you were talking about keeping poor risks. Right? And it seems offhand that those are two sides of the same coin, right? But it may not be in this case. It may not be because you are stressing, at least they have already been convicted of a crime. It's not like the bail situation, right? A suspect kept in jail because, fear of new crimes. I mean, judges here may not say that, but judges everywhere at the bar will tell you, yeah, appearance for trial is one thing, but new crimes is another. And if he's not in the bar, he's in his chambers, and you ask him that on television, you say appearance for trial is the criterion, right? But even setting that one aside, you are stressing that the person has been convicted of doing the harm, is eligible for that punishment, right? Would you keep that person longer than otherwise because he's a bad risk? Or forget the other ones you're going to release.
Okay, we have habitual offender acts anyway. You know, if you generally someone that would meet the criterion for the selective incapacitation has probably already has prior offenses.
Right.
More than likely they have prior offenses.
Right.
So in a lot of places, you're adding time onto that anyway.
The legislature did.
Right.
So they found that it was deserved somehow.
Right. So I don't really have a big problem with selective incapacitation because it's not like it's a first offense and we think you're going to commit maybe 5, 10 more, so we're just going to keep you 25 extra years. I don't think that's really the gist of what they're trying to do. I see it, like I said a minute ago, as more as a tool to cut down on the population. And they're basing that on there's good parts and there's bad parts, but the major, we get more benefit than we lose.
Okay, and by the way, I agree with you, but just so we're real clear about the argument, you didn't really answer my question about, say I'm in there for a robbery, and let's say the sentence that I have, maximum sentence, no matter what the parole board does, is 10 years. Would you advocate changing that and keeping me longer for the reason that I do a lot of robberies and I'm a poor risk?
If we didn't add any extra time on you legislatively, selective incapacitation might fit in with denying you parole and letting you serve out your entire sentence. And basically that's the same kind of philosophy that they have.
But isn't there sort of a supposition that I deserve the 10 years? But you're not arguing that I ought to do more than deserve for the crime because of the argument that I'm a poor risk. I don't hear you arguing that.
No, I'm not arguing that.
Okay, but you are arguing that, see, I hear you arguing not for selective incapacitation. I hear you arguing for selective deinstitutionalization.
To me, it's the same thing.
Aha, but I'm wanting to raise the question whether it's the same thing, and I think attitudinally it's quite different.
For some people, yes, it is.
Yeah, and the errors are different, by the way. See, I think the ethical arguments are different, and I think the errors are different. See, according to your scheme, and mine if I may join you with it, selective deinstitutionalization, our mistakes are going to be the false negatives. See, because when we start releasing more and more because we've measured and assessed and done whatever we could to select good risks, we're going to make mistakes. Those mistakes are going to hurt people, right? And those are the mistakes we want to minimize. But our scheme now is that we can reduce prison population by selective deinstitutionalization without a great risk to the public, impact on this terrible problem we have, and we're not punishing anybody more than already was found to be deserved, however that was arrived at, legislature and court. So that's why I was pressing you to say, would you keep me longer than deserved? The notion actually is not mine. The first one that I ever heard of that spoke about this is Norval Morris, who talked about desert as a limiting principle, not a definitive principle to set the sentence, but a limiting one, so that you could do utilitarian aims, incapacitation, treatment, deterrence, or whatever, within whatever the bounds are set by desert, set the limits set by deserved punishment. So that's one kind of solution, and I think you were adopting it, but I just couldn't get you to say it. But,
Yeah, you're right.
yeah. So that would be Norval Morris' sort of position, as I understand it, that there's some limits set. You could use the utilitarian aims within that. The other people, though, will argue, no, you can't go that far. You're going to violate the principle of proportionality. If you do that very much at all, you're going to put people into a treatment program. You're going to serve more time, because of that aim. Maybe it's within those limits, but you set up broad limits. You're just like the parole board with indeterminate sentencing. You're going to violate the proportionality principle, so some people are going to be in treatment, being punished longer for treatment, good motives and everything, but they're getting more punishment than deserved according to the desert view about proportionality of punishment. So still there will be those folks who say, no, you can't do that. But it is possible to conceive of those limits. Then you get into the question, how wide are those limits supposed to be? How much discretion in there will you allow for the selective deinstitutionalization?
I see the selective incapacitation as basically the same justice issue that I believe was Sinclair. I think it was Sinclair Lewis. It's one of the Lewises. The Sinclair Lewis argued against the medical model, and in article about 73. He argued that the medical model was bad, or the rehabilitative model, because it was not just, because we were keeping people as long as we determined we should keep them. And basically it's the same justice question here, but from the different perspective. One was the rehabilitative thing, where we kept people until we felt they were cured, and in this case, we keep people as long as we think they're going to be harmful.
Have the same arguments against it from the desert perspective, wouldn't
Yes.
it? Exactly right. Yeah. Right. Okay, let me raise a different sort of issue, and then we'll come maybe to break time, and I'll show you these pictures I brought at great expense made because I was all out of a Xerox number, and I overused my quota. We have a number on the machine, so I got to use some of them. Here's the proposition. Suppose that you go over to Las Vegas, it's nearby, and you go to the casino, and you go to the roulette wheel, and you might be inclined to place $1 on a number. I mean, it's only $1, right? Let's say you put $1 on number 28. There are 36 numbers. There's a 0 and a double 0. So there are 38 chances, 38 opportunities for the ball to go in the little hole. So your odds of winning are 1 out of 38, right? So that's the risk you're taking. 1 out of 38. And I'm claiming you might put $1 on number 28 anyway. 28 is a perfect number. Perfect number is any number that's the sum of all divisors. 28 happens to be 1. 6 is 1. So my theory of playing roulette is you might as well bet on a perfect number. So I bet on 28. Okay, so the odds are 1 in 38, right? I doubt that you would bet $1,000. You might. But you probably wouldn't. I would be willing to bet. I'd be willing to guess that you would not. Now we're talking about the stakes. The prudent gambler obviously considers both the risk and the stakes in deciding whether or not to place a bet. And the value of a wager is the product of the risk times the stakes. Multiply them together, said to be the value of the wager for decision theorists. So, prudent gambler considers the stakes too. Well, what would that mean for us? That would mean that you may have some measure of risk, such as success or failure on probation, or success or failure on parole, or some measure of doing crimes at a great rate, like Peter Greenwood or whatever. That would give you a measure of risk, but it wouldn't give you a measure of stakes. We have usually in this field a very crude criterion of outcome, like new crimes or not, parole violation or not, or whatever. Pretty crude. Maybe better than nothing, but still pretty crude. So, but it will give you a measure of risk, but it won't give you a measure of stakes. So the question is, what would the stakes look like? Well, let me claim that you would know an offender that came into corrections for a homicide conviction. No prior record, 52 years old, accountant all his life. You know, never been in trouble. You do the statistics, he's classified as a good risk. But you know, he did a murder. He's a good risk, but we know we make errors in prediction. The stakes are higher. So he's a good risk, relatively high stakes offender. Okay? You know this other guy, he's a young man, he just came into the institution. He's been stealing all his life. Every time you let him go, Commissioner, Professor, he steals. He doesn't do anything worse than that. He never hurts anybody, but he always steals, and you know if you let him loose, he's going to steal again. He's a poor risk, by any measure that we would invent, by our recipe or whatever. He's a poor risk, but he's relatively low stakes. He's a nuisance type offender. So now we have high risk, low stakes. Question. Can you classify people according to both risk and stakes? And this makes sense in terms of a strategy for sentencing along the lines of our discussion. Now we have a grid, stakes on one dimension. We've got people classified by stakes. I have a picture of it. Better without the picture. Anyway, what it says is, this says hypothesized relation of stakes and risk to incapacitation. This is stakes, it goes from high to low, and this is risk, it goes from low to high. So the assumption is you have some measure of risk, you have some measure of stakes. You can classify people, and if you were inclined to do incapacitation, it would be high stakes, high risk folks that you would tend to want to keep in confinement, and it would be low risk, low stakes people that you would want to selectively deinstitutionalize. So that's the sort of conceptual scheme that is in a framework very like guidelines used some places for sentencing, some places for paroling, such that you can classify offenders according to this grid, and that could give a model. What else goes into the stakes? Is it just the present offense? I think probably not. I think what else would go in there? Let's make it up. Pardon me? I'm sorry. You'd have to consider past offenses to some degree. Would you consider them for risk or also for stakes? It's a good question, I think, because maybe I'm here now for bad checks, but I've got an assault with a weapon in my record. That's not going to actually help me very much on the risk thing. But it's a stakes item, I think, to the person deciding on the release, because the person is concerned about that prior assault, and it raises the stakes for that offender, right? So I think that's very plausible.
There's going to be several variables for each. There's several variables that you're going to use to come up with your whatever number you're going to reach for your stakes, and there's going to be several variables that you use for your risk.
Right. I'm just trying to wonder what would plausibly be some other stakes variables. You know.
What type of crime you offended, whether it was an aggravated or not. Was it violent?
Violence, or present violence, or maybe history of violence. That would seem to me, that's right, yeah. That was what you were going to say. I thought escape might also be a record of a history of escape. I wonder about stakes, whether it all resides in the offender or whether it has, stakes maybe has a broader, more general meaning, that there may be a systems stake. That is, a judge may have a stake, he's an elected official, let's say. Parole board might have a stake that's independent of this. Some cases are more embarrassing, they go wrong, you know. There's a poor guy in Alabama in prison. His name is Willie Horton. I don't think that guy's going to get out very soon, no matter what he did. Now, maybe I'm mistaken, but his name is Willie Horton. Not the same Willie Horton, but you know, there's a different kind of stake involved. take just a few more minutes, and I'll tell you briefly what stakes items I thought of, and tell you briefly about a study done in New Jersey with some judges. What happened was that there are about 19 judges that filled out a questionnaire at the time of imposing the sentence. The objective was that they would do about 50 cases. They were willing. They filled out this questionnaire. And besides indicating the sentence, they gave their judgments about risk of new property crimes, risk of new person crimes, risk of any offense. They gave their judgments about the seriousness of the prior record. They gave their judgments about some other items like social stability was one they measured. Then they gave their sentence, but they also answered an item that had to do with the purpose of sentence. The way that was worded, which has some disadvantages, I apologize for it, but I had to make up this questionnaire overnight, and I did too quick a job because it looked like they were willing to do this. And I'd be quick. They had to choose among specific stated purposes of sentencing that they reviewed. They listed the items. One was called retribution, one called incapacitation, rehabilitation, deterrence, etc. They had 100 points, and they had to divide 100 points up among those purposes. So they could slice up the 100 points any way they wanted, but had to total to 100. So that was the scheme. So by that means, they expressed the purpose of sentencing. What I was interested in, among other things, aside from what we were working on together, we were working on the general topic of sentencing guidelines, and that's partly why they were doing this. But I had this stakes notion as well, so I made up a scale, just as we were doing a couple of minutes ago. And these were the items I invented, which some are the same that you just invented. I had whether there's physical damage to the victim in the current offense of conviction, whether it was an assaultive offense, whether a weapon was used in the offense, whether there's a history of violent offense, a history of sex offense, a history of robbery I put in, pretty solid, aggressive type crime, whether there's a stranger victim in the present offense, whether there's a probation or parole violation history, if it was not the first conviction, and whether, can't even read it from here. Oh, escape or absconding history. But bear in mind, I just made this up. And I put weights here, but I made those weights up too. So they're arbitrary weights. There are no statistics involved. I made it up. These are selected scales that were in the resulting data set. These two are they're called base expectancy scores, and they're a scale that was developed in California about parole violation. It's a risk prediction instrument. This is the same items, but in a Burgess scale. Interested again in seeing which worked better in a different sample, which held up. Greenwood approximation. This is the Greenwood scale that we were talking about, except it's from official data, official records data. Otherwise, tried to get as close as we could to Peter Greenwood's scale. This is the stakes scale that I just showed you, just made up. The other items are called judge's prognosis of any crime. I don't understand why I can't focus that better. That's just my focusing. Can't read it, can you? If I come closer. That's worse.
This thing wants to go up or down.
I don't know. Move it back, I guess, was better. Oh, no, it's not that. Not that. Hey, How did you do that?
Just had to force it
Yeah,
out.
that's great, thanks. Okay, so the other items, maybe if you're close enough, you can see the judge's prognosis, any crime, that is, judge's subjective risk prediction, prognosis about property crime, violent crime, estimate of the likelihood of violent crime. Then these were the judge's purposes: retribution, incapacitation, specific deterrence, rehabilitation, general deterrence. And then, we had the time served variable, which is actually time to be served. Okay? Not actual time served, but the time served in the sentence given. So that just shows you what the items were and the numbers. There were about 900 or so people sentenced in this exercise. This shows you just correlation coefficients for those items we just looked at. And they're actually kind of interesting. I mean, I wouldn't recommend to you spend all your time sitting around peering at correlation matrices, or that people would come and talk to you and read correlation charts, but I'm going to do it anyway. This shows that for the two base expectancy scales, correlation is about 0.86. That's not so. That's pretty high, but it's not surprising. Those are like equivalent forms of a test. Same with the Burgess. It's 0.60, so it's sort of measuring the same thing, but it's a little bit different. The correlation of those with the Greenwood scale, 0.57, 66, and 60. Some overlap. Well, it's about a third overlapping, but somewhat different. Of greatest interest here is looking at the time served variable, whether any of these items, either those scales or the judge's judgments or the judge's purposes, are related to time served. And it turns out correlation coefficients are low, but the judge's prognosis of a person crime has the highest single correlation coefficient for the sentence given. That says that if the judge marked down that he thinks the odds are pretty good that the person will do physical harm if released, the sentence was higher. Not too surprising, but it's the highest single one. His judgment about property crime was also substantial for this set, 0.22. None of these prediction scales were related to time served, which is not so surprising, except the Greenwood approximation had 0.17. There are only the coefficients that were statistically significant are listed there. Otherwise, there's a blank space. The stakes variable, which I made up, correlated 0.22, which was, second best in the set. So then we thought, well, having made that up, still sticking with the stakes story, how could we refine that scale a little bit? I don't have the final one, but what we did essentially was to reduce the numbers down by the strategy that said, well, the judge is making an estimate of violent crime likelihood, but that's because we never told him this concept of stakes. It's really stakes that's involved here. So we're going to take the judge's judgment about the likelihood of violent crime, and we're going to model our scale on his judgment. So we took the judge's judgments, that's the dependent variable. We did a multiple linear regression, and we selected those items and gave them weights from our initial stake scale. So now we're predicting that judge's judgment, but we call it stakes. Then the question is, how well can you predict the sentence? This is only looking at the decision of the judge whether the person went to prison or not. And this shows the star here means that's our revised stake scale, somewhat smaller number of items. That says that you got a significant effect for the judge's prognosis about any crime. You got a significant F value for rehabilitative intent of the judge, which is inversely related to confinement. That is, with the rehabilitative intent, the tendency of the judge was not to confine, right? And the stakes measure, revised, gives a significant effect as well, and so does the prognosis about a person offense. So on whole, with just these few items, pretty good. R squared of 0.42, correlation coefficient of 0.65, which is reasonably respectable for predicting the outcome of sentencing, no matter what literature you look at. If you look at official record data and, use the offense and prior record and so forth, it would be unusual to get probably that high correlation. Usually correlations would be even lower than that. So that's sort of in the right ballpark. Then well, that's not very much. That just shows if you do a discriminant function, it shows you that using these four variables, you can correctly classify who went to prison and who didn't in 80% of the cases. So that's even a little more convincing than looking at R squared 0.42. 80% of the time, you make the correct classification of what the judge actually did from those four variables. That's for the in-out decision. This is trying to predict the sentence itself, that is the length of time for those offenders that were given some time in confinement. Not quite as a high correlation coefficient. It's 4.0, so the R squared is only 16, so you could say 16% of the variance. And the variables that were helpful were the prognosis for person offense, same for property offense, rehabilitative intent again, and the stakes item. None of which is particularly related to the chart I put up or our prior discussion, but this table is. This table is an analysis of variance in the in-out decision analyzed by stakes and risk. So from the chart that I showed you, you would, if you wanted to follow that logic, you would predict that there would be an interaction between your measure of stakes and your measure of risk on the in-out decision. This says that there was a stakes effect. This says that there was an effect of the judge's prognosis for doing any kind of an offense. And this says that the interaction, stakes and risk, was not significant. It's 0.32. So it didn't work. Didn't support the hypothesis, although it was in the direction that you would expect. This is the same analysis, but for time to be confined, if the person is to be confined. And here you get prognosis of any effect, any offense, significant. Get the stakes variable, significant. Lo and behold, you get the interaction effect. Stakes by risk does have a significant effect. So it does support the logic of the little chart I showed you. And it did predict, post-dict, back the same sample, that might be close to what the judges were doing. So it's my conjecture that that is close to what judges actually do. If that's the case, there would be value to extending the argument by getting the best measures of risk that we could find, but we sort of know technology to do that, but also trying to improve the measure of stakes, and then to look at the sentencing decision with better measures of these two concerns. My question for you, why I came here to ask you to be consultants, which we take up after a short break, is do you think this will work? Notice that in that grid, it doesn't say anything about punishment. This could be a totally utilitarian construct for sentencing or for criminal justice. I could be totally, utterly opposed to punishment. and nevertheless have a scheme that might meet your requirements, I'm going to classify people by stakes as well as risk. And I'm going to have a rational criminal justice policy based on these two dimensions. And I don't need to talk about punishment. I don't need to talk about a society with a criminal law that says doing harm to people is going to be prohibited, and if they do it, we'll do harm to them. Will it work after the break? Please tell me.
5 minutes.
I can develop a sentencing theory, sentencing philosophy based on stakes and risk, and so that I have no need for the concept of deserved punishment. And I'm willing in that model to say, well, the broad limits of the sanction, whatever is done, will be set by desert. That is, we will not place people or classify people into different placements in any way that will result in their perception of punishment more than is thought to be deserved by the usual process of legislature, judiciary, whatever.
I have a problem with the definition. Confusion exists in my mind as what is the definition of risk in relationship to stake, particular definition so we can separate the concepts.
Okay. I'm using risk to just mean the probability of some criterion that has to do with new crimes being committed. I mean, we want to be that vague, but there's some specific criterion, and it's an empirical measure of risk that means the probability of that event occurring. We'd have to be more specific to do it right, of course, like the first step, define the criterion. But that's what risk means. So it's just probability of some new harm. The stakes one has to do with what kind of harm will it be if the person does harm. But it's the expected harm. Right? And I'm claiming that I don't then need the punishment concept. And then I could, for example, I could make sentencing guidelines with a grid like this, classify people, risk, and stakes. I could let judges have some discretion within narrow bounds. I could make them give reasons if they departed, right? I could have a sentencing commission to review that periodically, keep track of deviations from the use of the guidelines and so forth. The policy changes, they change the guidelines, you have a monitoring system, etc. So that would be a way to implement for sentencing decisions what I'm talking about. It might be, but I would like it to be a deinstitutionalization model, just as the young lady said. But if you want to argue those are two sides of one coin, then yeah. But incapacitation in this model would have that stricture that there would be an upper limit to what would be done with persons. That would depend on the harm done. Because probably that construct is so deeply embedded in society that we're going to have some element of that. So that's sort of a realistic, kind of concession to make.
So your tool is going to evaluate whether they're high risk, low stakes, or high stakes, low risk.
Right.
What's going to be done from it? Is the judge going to look at that, going to see your tool, and okay, this guy's been evaluated to be high stakes but very low risk. And he just decided, does he take it from there, or does your tool continue?
Well, do I get to invent it, the whole thing? I would probably invent a Sentencing Guidelines Commission to structure this tool, put that together some way. Then the judge is going to be required to use this device, right? So he's going to have to set the sentence according to the classification on stakes and risk. I would prefer if he has some discretion in there I would prefer that there be 2 points in which the judge has some discretion. One is within the classification, there might be some range of penalties, which might even include that you could, select jail term or probation term. I mean, I would be willing to do that with some cases. But you see how it would be graded in terms of community penalties, maybe gradations on probation. You've got minimal supervision, you've got medium, you've got intensive supervision, you've got special intensive supervision, you've got super intensive high supervision, then you've got, you've got minimum custody, you've got gradations throughout corrections. So I'd have all those gradations. But then the judge would have some discretion within those individual cells, but not very much. But it would not only be suggested or an opportunity for the judge, but it would be required that the judge will consider whether the guidelines don't fit. The model doesn't work in this case, so the judge should go outside the guidelines, specify a different penalty within the allowable penalties by the legislature, but state the reasons. And some reasons wouldn't be allowable by the Supreme Court. For example, reasons included already in the guidelines. You couldn't do it. If you had prior violent offense already in your stakes measure, judge couldn't say, no, I'm going to sentence this guy to 20 years because of that prior violent offense. That's redundant. It's already taken account of. The judge couldn't say, the judge in Minnesota used Minnesota guidelines, went outside the guidelines, wrote the reason. No, he wrote avid duck hunter. Avid duck hunter. The reason was that it was an offense with a weapon. If he sent him to prison for this offense, he could never again possess a weapon because now he'd be committing a crime, but only if he's sent to prison because that's the way the law was written. So he put him on probation because he was an avid duck hunter. The Supreme Court justice didn't like it because you can't do that. But anyway, I'd have that kind of limit.
The main thing I was wondering when I asked that is how is that weighted? I mean, someone that's very high stakes and very low risk, in my opinion, should be deinstitutionalized. But someone that's high risk but low stakes should be institutionalized. Because I mean that is what the prison is there for, criminals.
Is it?
Well, and I'm just saying that's my
Well,
view.
but aren't you going to get a lot of nuisance cases in there? Aren't you going to get a lot of these guys that just do confidence games and you want to clutter up your prisons at what is it, $50,000-$60,000 for a cell or more?
We put murderers in there, and we all know that in general they're not problem prisoners. They don't tend to reoffend, and they actually do very well on parole and probation.
That's all true. Yeah.
So why waste our resources? I know that the public at large is never going to go for that. But if we are doing this too, what I was really getting at is who is deciding when if you've got 2 people like that. I don't guess I'm understanding how you're weighting and what category these people are going to go into.
Well, I think your murderer case is going to be probably a relatively high stakes, right? Just by the offense.
We're not talking like an armed robbery with a murder, just a
Ordinary.
I separate that.
She killed her husband after long suffering, and she has no plans to remarry. She's low, relatively high stakes. She did it after all. There's a little bit of a. That's why many people in this room won't let you deinstitutionalize her quite so promptly.
But she's low risk, but she's high stakes. So what are you going to do with her? What is your tool going to do?
I don't know. I mean, I'm just making it up. You understand? I don't know. I think she's somewhere in the middle ground, though. Actually, it's true because of that. Not the highest stakes, but relatively high stakes because it was by golly murder. People get very afraid. See? That's the trouble.
But that's what happens when you deviate from legal perspective sentencing.
Well, present perspective, she's going to prison
Right.
for a long time.
What's the point in having a tool if we're not going to use it on all the touchy cases? That's basically
You're right. No, you're right. You're exactly right, because it's the touchy ones that are the problem. And there are a lot of cases where there's no question, right? I mean, a person's going to prison, or a person's going to probation, you know that. It's the middle range where we're working. You're right. I don't know.
Aren't you taking an awful lot of discretion away from the judges in utilizing this sort of thing? And to my mind, this would be where the biggest problem would be, because by and large, judges want to have all the, or at least in Texas they do anyway, they want to have all the control and discretion. And when you start giving them pretty narrow parameters to operate in.
You're right. I'm taking away more than they want me to take. I'm not taking away all of it. It's true they would like to have as much as we'll give them, you know. But, you know, there are great problems of disparity in sentencing that judges, by and large, will agree are serious problems and so forth. If you don't take it all away and you make it a reasonable system, particularly if they're a part of developing it, if it's seen as a reasonable system and they have a way to work with it, such as going outside the rules and specifying why and so forth, my experience is that many judges will go along with it, even though you suspect at the start that they won't. Same with parole boards. At first they don't like it. Then they sort of decide, well, we don't like it, but it might be a good thing. And they end up, some of them, being true converts and arguing more for it than I would argue. I mean, that has happened someplace. In bail, for example, in Philadelphia, judges didn't like it worth a hoot. Now they have guidelines. They were party to developing them. They use those guidelines for the bail decision, and they think they're the greatest thing. So, I'm sorry. Yeah.
On your voice model, I noticed that when judging those factors, you did not take into account time, i.e. the time sent. The guy is committed, for instance, at age 18, an assault with a weapon. He's now 35 and being charged with something else. I notice your model didn't take into account the fact that he's gone X number of years without a repetition of crime. Did you address that?
I would imagine that would be a helpful thing to try to address, yeah. No, I'm just starting in this business, especially for the stakes one, just thinking about it. But I would think so. I would think somehow there ought to be a decay function with time. If it was that long ago, somehow it's lesser important to us, isn't it? Or maybe it disappears entirely after time. I don't know. But partly it's a question to try to figure out what would be a kind of a reasonable model, and partly it might be an empirical question. If you could find some independent measure of stakes, you might be able to empirically determine how do you deal with that kind of problem. That's a good point, I think. How long ago?
I would think that a tool that could add consistency would have to be valuable. I would think that most judges would at least like to have some hard copy to glance at when they're making the hard decisions. At least here are some ideas. It seems that this is what we were discussing at the beginning of our discussions here. How do we add consistency to the entire system? And in a sense, consistency is closer to justice than inconsistency. I think most would agree to that concept.
Sure.
The other side of that is from the offender's point of view. One of the most frequent comments I heard about parole boards, indeterminate sentences, or everything, from offenders was they never knew where they stood. And it's when you've got people with comparable crimes, and they've all got different sentences, that's one of the most frustrating things about doing time is you just don't know. And if I see fairness, and I see offenders believing that your system is fair also, because equal people will be weighted.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Similar penalties for similarly situated offenders. Yeah.
Would this model be different for, say, different parts of the country? Are you advocating a model that would be not only would apply consistency, say, to the Texas judicial system, but would apply one region? Because the reason why I asked that is we had to look up some articles on sentencing and disparity for another class, and I read several that dealt with regional differences between north, south, or between states,
Yeah.
southern states, northern states,
Yeah.
in relationship to elderly felons in particular,
Yeah.
and how the north convicted elderly felons differently than did the south. And would you create some sort of model that would take into account urban versus rural, or suburban versus north and south, and all that in this model?
Yeah, I don't know. I think it's a very important, good question. I suspect that you, to some extent, would have to tailor it to the culture of the place where you are, because crimes have different meanings in different locations. If you go cut a barbed wire in Hoboken, it's pretty trivial. You go cut one in Texas, it's probably significant. Just differences like that. There's different meaning to the two acts. So I suspect you, but to tell you the truth, I haven't thought it through enough to know. If you had a sentencing commission or something for talking about sentencing, probably that would tend to take account of at least in a broad way, at least it would be a Texas commission if we're talking about Texas. If you didn't do that, see, another way to try to do this sort of thing would be to develop guidelines along that framework, but with judges. Well, I don't know, but I suspect if you had all the judges in Texas, they'd be arguing that point when they got. But at least, it would surface that argument. It would be open. It would be public. They'd be arguing about it. So I think it is a sticky wicket.
What about plea bargaining? Because you have people that come in that have plea bargained down to less offense. Is that they're trying to use your grid on the offense that he's actually being charged with, or the offense that he actually committed?
Yeah, two good points. One is that you got the prosecutors now, they have the guidelines you just invented. So, they're using those as a basis for the negotiation. So they do get quickly involved in that negotiation because you change the offense, here's what it will mean in terms of the sentence policy. Much more clear than it was before, and it might. That's right, and that's right, it might. The other question is, do you sentence a person for what she did, or do you sentence a person for what she was convicted of doing? And you always get that. I mean, that's a hard proposition. The United States Parole Commission, and they have guidelines somewhat along this general line, and they decided they were going to parole on the basis of the behavior involved in the offense, not the conviction. So far as I know, that wasn't overturned yet by the Supreme Court or anything. In Minnesota sentencing guidelines, I believe that they used the offense for which there was a conviction.
Do you feel like this could possibly also be adapted to a parole board, who also is?
Yeah, I'm here to argue that in order to hear your objections. Yeah, it seems that it fits. That's sort of what a parole board does. They make judgments about risk, and they make judgments about the societal stakes that are involved, or the stakes to the parole board, whatever. Might fit.
Assume that you build your model works, we'll place it into perspective. How long before we can just eliminate and decriminalize those crimes for which we're going to put the guy back into society? I mean, I see a build here for almost a medical model of saying, okay, this is wrong, we can fix it with a pill. You go home. This is wrong, you've got to go sit in a jail cell. Why not just take all of these folks for which we're going to fix with a pill, i.e., pat them on the hand and tell them to go and sin no more, and just decriminalize what they're doing, have a limited number of crimes, and plug them right into the system, slam, you do it, you go, two from column A, one from column C, read the chart, and eliminate the system. I know culturally that's not going to work, but from a technological standpoint, we're almost making justice to the point that we plug you into a matrix. And when we find your little cubby hole, like going over to the post office box and finding your post office box, you open it up and read the sentence.
Uh-huh.
Where are we going to stop with this?
Yeah. What do y'all have to say? One thing I would say is that I wouldn't advocate that cubbyhole system. See, I would want to advocate enough discretion, enough room for maneuver in that system that it doesn't match that. You know, that doesn't match what you just said. That all you got to do is classify the person. You know what it's going to be. I don't think we can make it quite that simple. I think there's a need for discretion and so forth. But setting that aside, you're still raising the question, okay, if you're going to screen people out of prison, why not just decriminalize those offenses and be done with it? I'll be interested in what other people say about that, but I would think that there would be people here who work, for example, in probation, who would take issue. And you sort of had an implication that nothing goes on in probation. Now, you could maybe carry that argument quite a ways, I don't know. But I think there may be people here who say, you know, a lot goes on in probation. Probation can be improved, needs to be strengthened. But, you know, counseling does help some folks. I mean, I think there would be some people here, maybe I'm wrong, that would take issue with the notion that probation is a fancy way of doing nothing while claiming to do something. They will claim there's more to it than that, I believe. Am I wrong?
Yeah. And so what, 20% of the people aren't going to change no matter what you do to them. They're not going to make it. And then 20% are going to make it no matter what you do to them either. And then so 60% in between.
But you can do something there. So you wouldn't necessarily decriminalize all those offenses on the basis that they're going on probation anyway. So
What about fines?
she doesn't think it's quite doing nothing. Pardon?
Fines. That's something we
Fines.
haven't discussed at all. It doesn't get a person involved with any possibility of incarceration, yet we still consider, like here, Class C misdemeanors at the bottom of the heap. There's still something that society wants to mark as being unacceptable conduct, but at a very low level of seriousness. The stakes are very low.
So that may be an argument that even though the sanction is not a really profound one, nevertheless there's some symbolism involved that signifies this is a wrongdoing, you're not supposed to do it, and so forth, and there may be value in that. Okay.
I don't understand your model as looking at only offense medium. I see it as looking at behavior patterns. So you can't decriminalize offenses
Mm-hmm.
based on
That's
your
right.
model. That's not
That's right. It looks a little bit like an attempt to partly get away from so much dependence on the offense.
That's the way I see it.
I think that probably is right. Sir.
I think with your model, you may have a tendency to have the same corruption that happened in sentencing guidelines. I mean, sentencing guidelines, when they were first brought up, is a way to change things. We're going to make sentencing better and less disparate, things like that. By the time it got through the legislative mill, they said, okay, we're going to adopt your guidelines, but we're going to throw a little just desserts on there and raise the level of penalty, and we're going to increase sentence lengths. And I got a feeling that even though you're saying that you can leave punishment completely out of your model and just look at risk and things like that, by the time it goes through that legislative mill, it's going to be the same thing. By the time it gets out of legislation and gets into practice, there's going to be the punishment attached to it that you didn't have there, but the legislature and the committees have attached to it, and all the things that you're trying to leave out are going to wind up being put on there.
So it's possible that you could invent a scheme like guidelines, which is independent of the level of sanction. If it's independent of the level of punishment, harshness, or leniency of sanction, right? Independent of that, actually. But you're saying that provides a mechanism for people to get more punitive?
Right. By the time it gets to the legislative mill.
Question would be, this is not Texas, you don't have guidelines, I can tell you. Say Minnesota. Let's say for the purpose of argument, penalties have got harsher in Minnesota. I don't know that they have.
They did so.
Did they? Okay, say they got harsher. Question, would they got harsher anyway, or was it, guidelines the culprit?
Guidelines weren't necessarily the culprit, but it seems as though the system was changing anyway. I mean, by the time, when it got to the legislature, they're saying, okay, we need to take part of what we're doing in sentencing and change that. Well, as long as we're going to change it, this is a...
This is a dandy time to,
we're going to get tough on crime as long as we're doing it. So it wasn't necessarily the guidelines that did it, but since there was change going on in adopting the guidelines, they threw in the let's get tough on crime along with it kind of as an appendix.
I'll bet you in New Jersey we've outdistanced Minnesota in increasing the severity of sanctions in recent years, and we don't have guidelines. We have increased sanctions at every opportunity, and in any given week, just now, there are 80 to 90 bills in the legislature that would take selected offenses and increase penalties. 80 to 90 at any given time. They won't all survive, but every once in a while, one of them survives. So I don't know. It's a good question, but I don't know to what extent the guidelines would be
Well, as long as they're taking,
the right culprit.
like with guidelines, you have to take offenses and reassign a sentence length to them to a certain extent. You're kind of reevaluating that. And as long as you're doing that reevaluation and putting a different sentence on there, it seems that there's a tendency to just bump it a little bit.
There may be, but the young lady sitting next to you would probably bump it the other way.
And happen.
I'm guessing, but from the way she talked. Pardon me?
Most of the guidelines that have been implemented so far, almost straight down the line, no one's been reducing, everyone's been increasing it and bumping.
But it's not a necessary
No,
consequence.
it's not necessary.
If you could make a persuasive enough argument that this group ought to be removed from confinement and dealt with in other ways, and this is a group that ought to be in intensive supervision instead of confinement, based on evidence elsewhere or whatever, you might win the day. I mean, it's possible you'd win the day, and the guideline structure would have helped.
It's always
So I don't know. I think it's a very good point.
You can take guidelines, and if you're making them more sure to a certain extent, you're putting down basic sentences that they're going to have to serve, that you can ease up on them a little bit and make them easier. That would make guidelines easier to accept. It would control your overcrowding problems. Same way with your model. You could back off a little bit and certainly help your overcrowding problem, but that doesn't seem to pan out in the political realm.
What about a
Just a-
combination of the two, using both criterion, one to set the stakes risk sentence, and then one as a punishment sentence? So you're using guidelines to determine how many years he should get for doing this particular act. Say he gets 3 years for that. Look at your stakes risk chart, see how many years he should get considering the stakes and the risk. Add the two together. Wouldn't you make both people happy?
Make everybody happy but the poor convicted person.
No, I understand you wouldn't. I mean, you would be punishing him for his act, period. And not punishing him and not taking into consideration his stakes and risk chart.
Okay, there's a portion of the penalty that's going to be satisfaction for the harm done, right?
On your chart?
No, in your conceptualization. A part of the sentence is due to that. Another part is due to societal concerns, which include both the risk he presents and the stakes.
Right.
And you add them together, that would be the composite term. Which, by the way, I was being a little facetious. It wouldn't necessarily be a more harsh or less harsh penalty than now. The logic of arriving at it would be different, right? The main objection, I guess, I would have to that is the philosophic one, that you've used the two fundamentally opposed views and put them together and said, okay, we'll have both. Which just is not very satisfying philosophically.
By using one or the other, if you use just yours, the stakes and risk, they're going to throw in along the line, that person is going to get punished somewhere along the line. Somebody's going to do it, and it's going to be arbitrary.
It's a good thought. I've gone over the time that Chairman allotted me. I thank you very much for the conversation.
Lunch is going to be at the concourse. Dr. Longmire is going to sign his bill for you so you can start them in.